Obama basically kicks off his presidency with his speech in Egypt, where he basically says it's a new day, it's a new kind of foreign policy, we're going to build bridges here, and it was an explicit rejection of a long-held American foreign policy tradition of recognizing Israel as our primary ally, primary ally for peace and democracy in the Middle East, and this sense that I think this genuine sense that Islam was not going to be a barrier to peace anymore. As we look at what happened in Libya a decade ago, maybe talk to us a little bit about the situation for Coptic Christians in particular, and these particular Christians were martyred in Libya. Where were they from? What was the world from which they were sort of drawn into the conflict?
Absolutely. So maybe just a quick background on Copts as a people first, before we dive into the background of these 21 men. So the Coptic Christians are the Christians of Egypt. The word Coptic is actually a Greek word, and it means Egyptian. It's what the ancient Egyptians it's what the ancient Greeks used to call the ancient Egyptians. This ethno-religious minority has been in Egypt since what I consider to be the beginning of time. The ancient Egyptians had these similar ideas to Christianity, a forgiving God and an afterlife. So when St. Mark the Evangelist traveled to Egypt around 60 to 70 AD, the ancient Egyptians began converting to Christianity en masse. And at one point in time, Egypt was a majority Christian country. And then you had different empires rise and fall, particularly the Arab conquest of North Africa and Arabia. And that's really when you had the demographic begin to slide in different directions. And what was once a majority Christian country eventually became what we know now as the Arab Republic of Egypt, which is a majority Muslim country. And through these periods of time, the Copts have had waning and waxing periods of persecution. There were times where the Copts had it pretty decent, living as a minority under Islamic rule, and there's been times where it has been not so great being a Christian, being a Copt in Egypt. I think if I had to put right now, where does the state of persecution of Copts in Egypt fall on the spectrum of good to not so hot? I'd put it maybe slightly towards the not so hot section. And persecution's different. So, we see all these stories coming out of Nigeria where there's Christians being beheaded every day because of their faith. That isn't exactly the case for Egyptian Copts, for Coptic Christians in Egypt. Thankfully, there's no, at least not that I'm aware of, no beheadings en masse of Copts strictly for their faith, but there's subtle things like, a permit for a church takes years to approve because it needs the signature of the president, which is a little crazy. Like, it's a church building, repair a light bulb, fix a sink, all these things need permits, to other things like, if your name is Mariam Wahba, which is a very Christian name, you're not going to get admitted into the best universities, you're not going to get that job. Up until very recently, maybe in the last 3 or 4 decades, there would be job postings in newspapers that would at the bottom say Christians not need apply, because they're just not going to hire Christians for that role. So that kind of begins to paint a picture of who the Copts are and what is their situation in their ancestral homeland.
And there's often a kind of sort of cultural, sort of implicit bias, like everything from, if you get into a lawsuit, and it's a Muslim versus a Christian, that generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, there tends to be bias towards your own in-group. And when you're the minority, that implicit bias tends to run against you, operate against your best interests at times.
Absolutely, you're on the nose, and some of these things are actually written into law because Egypt follows Sharia law. So things like the testimony of a Christian in court is technically worth half as much as a non-Christian or a non-minority. So it's all little things that amount to you being a second-class citizen, if even that. That's being generous when referring to the Copts. So now we get to the 21 Martyrs of Libya. So the Copts are known for, especially post-1960s, 1970s, for leaving Egypt in search of better opportunities. My family is an example of that. Many other Coptic American families are examples of that. But those who can't make it to the West for whatever reason will go to other Arab neighboring countries in search of work or opportunities. And that's exactly what the 21 martyrs were. In fact, I'll actually just make a brief distinction here. 20 of the 21 were Coptic. There's a young man among them that is the 21st martyr that was not Coptic, but I'll get to his story, which is fascinating in a second. But yeah. So 20 martyrs were Coptic Christians from Egypt who had all been to Libya in search of work to help better their families' lives. They were all kidnapped by ISIS at varying points, and ISIS had given them an ultimatum. You renounce your faith and convert to Islam and presumably join ISIS. This was kind of a fuzzy part of the story, but it's kind of an assumed part of the story. Or you die at the sword. And these men endured torture and being given that chance to renounce their faith time and time again up until they were brought to that beach. And that's kind of the image that's at least seared into my mind, them being dragged in their orange jumpsuit by the ISIS militants to that desolate beach in Libya. Being placed down on their knees, and the Mediterranean's kind of in the background, and it's a really powerful image before the ISIS spokesperson, comes on screen and gives his soliloquy about why these men are about to die before they're beheaded for their faith.
Yeah. How long were they held before they were executed?
So different accounts of the story tell different. The men were kidnapped at different times. I think the longest group of them were held for about a month. Their families were notified, and about 3 days actually before that video appeared, some of the families received photos of the men in jumpsuits. And that was a sign of hope for them. Their family members were alive. But it was also a sign that the worst was yet to come. And it was ISIS's way of giving a warning shot to these families.
I think I don't want to get down the rabbit trail of that, but you think about what it is like to lose a loved one, to be abducted by one of these terrorist organizations, and just the uncertainty, and obviously sort of living through a different version of that now with watching what's happening in Gaza. So when they were executed, I mean, it's part of ISIS's whole strategy is propaganda. It's to instill fear. It's to put the names out there. And so in this particular case, their executions were filmed. They were produced. They were produced at a pretty high level. What happened? How did they come out? And how did that come out? And what was the intended purpose of executing them in the way that they were executed?
That is a fantastic question, Mike, and I'll kind of take your attention to two different points in the video. One is when the ISIS militant begins his soliloquy in the video. He says, "To the followers of the hostile Egyptian church," or something to that effect. The key word there that I'm certain he said was the hostile Egyptian church. And I found that to be ironically hilarious. Not that the moment is hilarious, but the fact that he used that word hostile, because anybody who knows Copts, whether individually or as a group, knows that we are some of the most passive group of people ever. We've endured persecution at insane levels for thousands of years, and we've pretty much done nothing about it. There have been a few rebellions here and there, and people have attempted to fight back, and you have the lawyers and the activists, but as a group of people, we're pretty passive, and we're one of the churches that can confidently say we have little to no blood on our hands. So I found that to be particularly an important part of the story that ISIS was trying to tell, painting the Coptic church as a hostile Coptic church. And then the second part of the video that really has stuck with me is the end scene of the video that ISIS released. And after they brutally murder the 21 martyrs, the camera shoots over to a scene in the Mediterranean where their blood almost floods the ocean. The waters of the Mediterranean turn to like a dark maroon color, stained with their blood. And to ISIS, I assume that image evokes victory. Like they have won this, what they perceive to be this battle in their fight for their belief systems. And to the Copts, it meant totally something else. It was almost like a baptism. Like these men had belief in their faith that they were willing to die for it, and not just, die in their beds, but die at the sword, at a brutal death. So those kind of two images stand out to me as some of the most evocative or provocative parts of the film, and how they can tell us what this meant to ISIS versus what this meant to the Copts. And I'm happy to kind of dig into a little bit more of what this meant to the outside world. Like, those are the two most apparent parties, but who else is involved?
No, I'd love to hear you talk about it, because there is something about, it is one of the unique, I almost want to call it like a literary trope of Christianity, is the blood of the martyrs, and the way the church has always been built on the blood of the martyrs. And it's almost as though ISIS couldn't have anticipated, sort of because of a lack of that sort of literacy with the Christian tradition, they couldn't have anticipated that what they were doing was going to actually, strengthen the resolve of Christians regionally and globally. So what happened when the video came out?
Yeah, so obviously it went viral, and every talk show, news outlet you could think of had it on their night segments. What I remember most from that time is a certain level of callousness that was used to speak of this incident. Obviously, this was terrorism. Duh, like, yes, it is terrorism, but it's so much more. Like, there's a lot more to it than just this was an isolated incident of wrong place and wrong time. These men were not targeted just because they were Copts, and ISIS knew that, and they were killed because they refused to renounce their faith. And I think that part was a little lost on Western media, and to that point, the clearest example of how lost this was on the West in general is the White House at the time, in the press statement that they released, called them Egyptian citizens. And it's not that they weren't Egyptian citizens, but that's not why they were abducted and murdered. They were abducted and murdered because they were Christians. They were Coptic Christians. So that part is fascinating to me, because the West really had a hard time contending with the reason why they were kidnapped, the reason why they were held and tortured, the reason why they were killed, from both the ISIS perspective and the Coptic perspective. ISIS kidnapped them because they were Copt. They died because they wanted to stay Copts. And that part just kind of got sanitized out of the story. And I'm curious what you think of that. Like, why do you think that happened? Was it just too uncomfortable for us to think about that?
Well, gosh, I think one of the things that you saw in and this would have been under the Obama administration, right? And so I think one of the things that you saw consistently with the Obama administration was a desire. I'm trying to figure out how much trouble do I want to make for myself with the comments I'm about to make here. Let's be careful with you can edit that line out. Okay. No, I think one of the things that you see in the Obama administration is a consistent effort of, like, Obama basically kicks off his presidency with his speech in Egypt, where he basically says it's a new day, it's a new kind of foreign policy, we're going to build bridges here, and it was an explicit rejection of a long-held American foreign policy tradition of recognizing Israel as our primary ally for peace and democracy in the Middle East, and this sense that I think this genuine sense that Islam was not going to be a barrier to peace anymore. That they were going to do whatever it took to do that, and to sort of lower the temperature, post the Iraq War and everything else around the way we talked about Islamic terror in general. Now, to his credit, Obama did the surge. He put the order out to kill Osama bin Laden. It's not like he was afraid to fight the war. He clearly fought the war. But I think so all that to say, I think what's reflected in the way they messaged that is it's kind of along the same, like it was the same impulse that in terms of the way they approached their Iran deal. It was like, let's do everything we can to lower the temperature. Let's do everything we can to sanitize is maybe the right word. I mean, it's to sort of sanitize the circumstances of it, and because what they were trying to do, I think diplomatically, was sort of keep this back door open to peace. With everything else that's going on around here, let's keep the back door open to peace. And if all of a sudden everybody in America gets incensed about ISIS, which is out to create this Islamic State, then and it's like ISIS killing Christians, that makes that diplomatic effort much more difficult for them. I'm not compelled that that's a good reason to do that, but I think that's what was going on there.
Listen to the full episode wherever podcasts are found.